Has Russia finally tapped out in Bakhmut? And are the Ukrainians going to make any more progress on the way to Crimea? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. It's December 30th, 2022. This is your daily Ukraine update. Let's get into it. Okay, first off, when we look at the control map, no change in territory anywhere, which is itself sort of interesting. Second, when we look here, we can see that in Bakhmut, there were very few attacks on the urban core of the city. One reportedly outside of the city well into this forested area here, and some to the south near Klitschivka. We also, of course, have one attack near Bakhmutsky, but as we've seen, the data has become increasingly clear that these attacks are extremely anemic. In a NATO force, these wouldn't be considered even attacks. They would be considered probing operations with 5 to 10 soldiers, and some of the video of these soldiers being almost certainly just forced to advance through open terrain seems pretty terrifying, honestly. It's a far cry from what is proven to work in this battlefield, which is well coordinated, appropriate tactics using all the resources available. Now, when we look to the north, we can see that, of course, Russians are attempting to counterattack on the Ukrainian offensive near Crimea. They haven't made much advances, but again, we would call this a spoiling attack. You can see here, Svatove, you have the Ukrainian effort to try to clear out some of these villages here. There's some rumors that actually Russian headquarters have actually withdrawn from Satove and moved themselves further inland to coordinate their forces from a more safe location. But it still seems like if there's going to be a decisive breakthrough, again, we're not seeing it yet. But as I said yesterday, 72 hours, I think, is the window from which, if Ukrainian forces are going to achieve a breakthrough, they're going to be able to do so before Russia can divert reinforcements to shore up this front here. And of course, when we look at War Mapper, he also reports no notable changes to control in Bakhmut or to the overall situation. So this is not itself interesting, I think. This is the ebb and flow of war, especially in the winter. Things are just going to run a little slower. Literally, you have less daylight. So for Russian forces operating, again, as it were, we're in some of the shortest days of the year. So they have the smallest window in which they can operate, and especially Russian forces without cold weather gear or good supplies. In the best of times, the need and logistical demands of winter operations are just vastly, vastly higher. Ukrainian forces probably much better equipped to conduct winter operations, but as we've seen, they too don't have extensive night vision devices, so they too are operating with a smaller window of operational time and space. All of this is interesting, but what's most fascinating is that Ukraine's military directorate has actually said, or at least the chief of their military directorate has said, that the situation is just stuck. Both Russian and Ukrainian troops lack the resources or ability to move forward. He said that Ukrainian forces cannot defeat Russian troops in all directions comprehensively. This is obviously true. And reiterated that Ukraine is waiting a supply of new and more advanced weapon systems. This is really interesting that the Ukrainian forces to sit there and openly say, hey, listen, we are sort of at a deadlock. Russia can't break us. We cannot break Russia. And I'm going to be honest with you guys. My long-term assessment of this conflict, a lot of people are like, how will it end? Well, remember, since 2014, the Donbas was not controlled by Ukraine. Russian-backed separatists maintained a low-intensity conflict that Ukrainian armed forces were unable to break. So I say that because there is a precedent for this sort of World War I style neutrality, right? Remember, World War I, there was a lot of movement in the first, it was really 16 weeks of that conflict. And then after about week 16 to 20, you began to see battle lines become set. And then the changes slowed to a glacial pace. And the reason it did was obviously, we say, oh, it's because it was trench warfare. Well, that's correct. But before World War I, there was no trench warfare as a concept. There was something called earthworks that was sort of analogous, but the idea was that simply the first 16 weeks were a massive learning curve at every level for these armies. Generals had to learn new ways to use their forces in the era of the machine gun. Commanders on the ground had to evolve new ways to move and shoot and engage targets in the era of the aircraft and the long range, highly accurate individual rifle. And troops needed new ways to protect themselves in the era of the long range artillery piece. All of that culminated in a steep learning curve, but after 16 to 20 weeks, that learning curve began to settle. And we see here in this conflict, right, we are 8 months in, so what's that, 32 weeks or so? And you can see that both sides, despite Russia's best efforts to not learn anything, are slowly learning how to counteract these new elements on the battlefield. Russia is becoming better at its counter battery fire. Ukrainian forces are becoming better and better at dispersing concentrations of Russian forces. And the result is that both sides are becoming better at protecting themselves from the other side's best weapons. Drones, artillery fire, aircraft, missile strikes. Each side, with every subsequent day, is getting better at mitigating the enemy's ability and understanding the enemy's capabilities. What does all this mean? It means that it becomes harder in a war over time to make major decisive breakthroughs. You also, of course, as we know in World War I, the troops, if one side has a decisive advantage, the longer the fight goes on, the more things move towards parity. And again, that's simply because you have troops gaining. You have some troops are being attrited down, as we've seen in Russia, right, where a very large army is being mismanaged and misdeployed, and is eventually ground down into something on parity with the Ukrainian armed forces, while the Ukrainian armed forces are growing in strength to match the Russian armed forces. The result is that oftentimes you end up in these stalemate type situations. And I actually suspect that there will be some portions of the war that look like this, very stable, as both sides try to find and come up with new ways to try to break these stalemates. So all in all, what do I think the future holds? Well, ISW does speculate that Russians are holding back, trying to consolidate their forces in an effort to make a more decisive push into Bakhmut. I think that's probably true, but really, if Russia was smart, they would just pivot to defensive operations, take the next 6 weeks and train their mobilized troops, let their logistical tail catch up to their forces, especially the newly mobilized forces who need body armor, who need helmets, who need radio communication devices. Let the logistical tail catch up, and then they can attempt to launch their decisive operation. I think Ukraine can be on a somewhat shorter time frame. It's possible that this Crimea advance is going to be it's hard to say if this breakthrough is something they're going to be able to exploit near Savolte. Will it be sufficient to really make meaningful advances? That is a question basically on everyone's mind. And I think if they can achieve a breakthrough, they should try to exploit it as much as humanly possible. Because if there's one thing we've seen, the Russian forces, they're not that capable they're not that adaptable and mobile, right? Their lack of communication, their lack of command means that they can't respond to changing situations quickly. So the Ukrainians, more than the Russians, have an incentive to engage in decisive lightning strikes and exploit the fact that Russian command is really slow and plodding. So these sort of small gains are almost not worth making because Russia can react to them. You have to make pushes that Russia can't possibly react to with their failing command and control structure, as well as their lack of mechanization in their forces now. All that to say, right, if there's one side that could stand to make a major push, I think it is probably Ukraine. We've also seen this could be a feint. I wouldn't rule it out. Ukraine made an excellent feinting attack in Kherson, right? Remember, there was the much touted, long discussed Kherson offensive, and in the reality, the offensive came from an unexpected direction in Kharkiv. That may be the case here, right? Savote is not especially tactically significant. People are like, oh, it's a central hub for supplying the north and south fronts of the Russian lines here along the Kharkiv-Crimea line. And that's true, right? You guys can see that for large portions, this major roadway here is outside of Ukrainian artillery range and feeds directly from Russian or Belarusian? Russian territory right into Russian-controlled Ukraine. So it's not insignificant to hold and capture Savote, but it's not as decisive as capturing, say, Lysychansk or Severodonetsk, or another like major capital, again, like the Donetsk city. So where would I would at least hold out the possibility that Ukrainian forces are engaging in a feint by creating a lot of very public hype about these efforts in Savote, maybe even putting out in the press that they feel that they are in a deadlock, and then launching a more decisive strike at an area where they think Russian forces might be at their most vulnerable. Probably not Bakhmut, right? And probably not Donetsk, since those are two regions where Russian forces are very concentrated. You also probably wouldn't want it to be here. I could see them trying to push towards Mariupol, exploit this sort of administrative control gap, but it's also easier to maybe even push through Kherson. There's options. But keep that in mind, guys. And as always, if you want, actually, it's dropping today is the latest update for the Patreon. It's all the combat video breakdowns that, YouTube won't let me show you, including a lot from Bakhmut itself. So if you guys want that, of course, check out the Patreon. Link is in the description. And thanks to my Lieutenant tier patrons. You guys are the one who make this whole thing possible. Thank you guys so much. I'll see you in the next one.